Thanks a lot.
Welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all lines are in a listen-only mode. During the question and answer session, please press star 1 on your touch-tone phone. I would also like to inform parties that today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now, I'd like to turn today's meeting over to Melissa Grasso. Thank you, ma'am. You may begin.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar on cybersecurity, evolving threats and defenses. I'm Melissa Grasso with the U.S. Commercial Service. I know a lot of you have been with us for the past 10 or so webinars that we've done, so I will make some just very brief introductory remarks. As a reminder, we have a good number of upcoming webinars for the balance of the month of July, as well as the month of August. So if there are some that you haven't signed up for, please feel free to visit our website, which is listed on your screen, and sign up for those. In terms of housekeeping, as with previous webinars, there will be a question and answer session at the very end of the presentation, and as with previous webinars, we will send out the net replay of this webinar. So without further ado, I'd first like to thank very much our sponsors from CohnReznick. I know cybersecurity is a topic that has received a lot of attention in the last couple years, so we're really excited to have Jim Ambrosini and Ken Fishkin with us today. Just to give a little bit of background, Jim Ambrosini is a managing director with CohnReznick Advisory Group, and he leads the firm's cybersecurity and technology assurance service offerings. Jim has more than 20 years of experience in the information security and technology sector and is focused on helping clients to manage their technology assets effectively and securely. And with his team, they specialize in analyzing technology infrastructure, evaluating cyber threats, developing strategic plans, and assessing network and web vulnerabilities. And with Jim today is his colleague Ken Fishkin, and Ken is a director also at with CohnReznick's advisory cybersecurity practice. And as a cybersecurity networking expert, Ken assists companies of all sizes to develop sound, proactive security strategies. His industry experience includes manufacturing, transportation, real estate, financial services, healthcare, and not-for-profit. Again, really excited to have you both with us, and I will turn things over to you. Thank you, Jim, for joining us. You should have control of the slides now.
Great. Thank you very much, Melissa, and welcome, everyone. Jim Ambrosini here with CohnReznick. It's a pleasure to be here speaking about this incredibly important and, frankly, often misunderstood topic. So today we want to clear up some of the mystery. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the evolving threats that companies are facing today, talk about some critical controls that need to be put in place. There's an incredible amount of changing regulatory landscape that's worth examining, and we'll touch on that. We'll go through a brief case study of a company that we work with, a global manufacturing and exporter, and then we're going to talk about one of the most a global epidemic, which is ransomware, and what you need to do about it. So with that, we shall begin. So, you know, it seems that just as technology has changed over the years, so has the various threats facing organizations. You know, I'm dating myself here. When I started my professional career as a programmer back in the early 90s, the biggest threat was considered internal. I was working on mainframes, and really they were pretty much unprotected. But no one really cared because no one thought of their own company data as the crown jewels, unlike today. Well, as we progressed, and remember the dot-com in the 90s, and I remember trying to educate various CFOs about why they need a firewall and how to protect themselves, but really the worst thing that could happen back then was taking down a website. E-commerce wasn't as evolved as it is now. And now, folks, it's actually escalated into all-out cyber warfare, where companies are being attacked by nation states as well as professional hackers, and it's a real struggle for companies to be able to deal with this. So, you know, if on this chart, you know, if I were to show this chart maybe even as early as 5 years ago, most companies may have been only dealing with one or two of these things as a top concern. Today, every single one of them is creating an issue. Phishing, denial of service attacks, vulnerabilities, insider threats, all of these things are having an incredible, causing an incredible amount of issues with our clients. And, ransomware is a great example of how things evolve. In 2016, ransomware probably wouldn't have even been put on a high-risk item on a security risk report. It's about a $25 million crime worldwide. Later that year, it escalated into probably almost $1 billion, and today it is, as we talked about, a global pandemic. And even different types of ransomware have evolved very quickly. This just goes to show you how on top of the game companies need to be in assessing their threats. So in March of this year, there was it's called a fileless malware. I'm not going to get into all the details, but this was actually how Russia allegedly attacked the U.S. Democratic National Convention, how they may have attacked some of the Ukraine missile defenses. And this attack was spawned from Russia, and it didn't even involve running any type of code. It ran in memory and then was able to download files and run vulnerabilities almost undetected. So then there was the WannaCry virus, which you probably heard of, 2 months after that. Again, a global epidemic, hit about several 100,000 computers worldwide. Didn't do a lot of damage, but caused enough issues. Some companies we know were actually shut down from it. And then earlier in June, they had another ransomware attack called Petya, which was a type of ransomware that was extracting files. And there was some theories behind this, that this was a smokescreen and a way for hackers, while they were dealing with ransomware, to actually hack companies. And then right after that, they actually came out, it's called not Petya, just so you wouldn't confuse it with the other one. That's another form of ransomware. So in a period of a couple of months, you had 3 or 4 global epidemics of just ransomware. So I think you kind of get the picture of what we're trying to say here, that it really is a problem, just even keeping up with the type of attacks that companies need to deal with. But really, from our opinion, and speaking with numerous security experts, really a lot of the problem is less about the hackers. It's more about IT complexity. So if you think about where the world has evolved in the last couple of years with cloud computing, you have customer portals. You all, I know, you're import-exporters, and you're dealing with other type of business partners that have access to your systems. You have ERP systems, vendors. All of these things create an enormous challenge to your IT professionals just trying to keep the lights on and keep things up and running, let alone trying to be able to defend these things. This was a survey from Gartner, and just to show you what some of what a lot of firms are thinking as their biggest impact on the business. And you can see all of these things, including security, but still all of the things listed there are very technical aspects of business, right? They all involve new technologies, new rollouts, new training. Again, all of these things and devices, everything up there can be attacked and hacked. And on top of all of this, you have an incredible lack of talent when it comes with, or available resources when it comes to cybersecurity. I've checked the reports. I think there's something like 200,000 unfilled jobs in the U.S. alone. Don't quote me on that, but you could do some research. But there's a lot of open positions. And all of these threats have created a demand which cannot be filled. So it also hinders companies' performance when it deals with cybersecurity threats. And this was another survey from Gartner where you have security listed as its top, as one of its top challenges over the next couple of years. So this is very important and encouraging. It does show that they're struggling with this, but at least they recognize it. And yet, when you go to some of the planned investments, and this is just in security, there's a lot of things going on here, but some of the latest and greatest tools and technologies that are on the bottom of this list, threat detection, incident response program, this is really where companies struggle, and they're not really making those type of investments. And then on top of all of this, just to add to the issue, trying to find a malicious actor, as we call them in the security world, or malicious person on the network is incredibly challenging. You know, we're actually working on a case right now. It's actually a mega breach. We're working with 5 state attorneys general on this, and this particular company, the hackers were on the system for probably about 8 months. And that's because they were there, they know what they're doing, they go what's called low and slow, and they probe. So even companies that have some of, and this company did, had all the latest tools, hackers are still able to usurp those capabilities and remain undetected. So essentially, all of what I just said creates this perfect storm, if you will, when it comes to hacking. You have an incredibly large, complex infrastructure, much of which is left open or unprotected. You have limited IT resources. You have a constant demand for infrastructure and growth and initiative to perpetuate that, even to do business, and hackers are becoming more sophisticated. All of these things are happening all at the same time, my friends, which is why it's so very difficult, and which is why most breaches take over 200 days to uncover. So to help put things in perspective, that, you know, there is a lot of different tools and techniques and frameworks out there to, you know, to help with this. So where we come from and what we've seen successful, what we believe, is that cyber is really a socio-technical phenomenon. And by that it involves good processes, good risk management capabilities, capable people, as well as some of the high-end tools and features that can detect some of these threats. Now, we're not going to make any recommendations, and we're certainly not advocating implementing new tools. But there are a lot of technologies out there that can help with this program, but it still needs to be supplemented with very capable people. You know, the U.S. military is a perfect example for this, particularly in submarine warfare, where you have very complex systems, high-risk environment, and yet capable people all working in tandem to create appropriate defenses and achieve the mission. And it's actually a very good analogy to what needs to be done with cyber. So what we advocate is you can actually get a lot better results by simply asking better questions about cybersecurity. So rather than go out and try to spend money on the latest, greatest tool or do the latest assessment, just take a step back and ask yourself a couple of logical questions. And these, frankly, are questions that really any senior level executive or business owner, CFO, board of director should be asking. When did you perform the last cyber risk assessment? What did it cover? You know, so many companies have never even performed this, or they've done one 2 or 3 years ago. Like we were talking about, threats change literally almost on a monthly basis. You need to keep that up to date and do it at least once a year. Do you know where your critical data is? Seems like a pretty basic question, but in the realm of today's world, where you have systems that are interfacing, you have third-party providers, you have cloud computing, you have people downloading things on spreadsheets, you really need to take stock of where that critical data is, or any type of data that you want to protect. This next one I highlighted because this one all companies fall down on. Would you be able to recognize a breach? Work with your IT folks or managed service provider and ask that question, because it does take some high-end tools with daily processes, formal policies, et cetera, to really be able to do that. If you don't have that capability, you're not going to be able to find out until it's too late, meaning after they suck the data out. That company that I was just talking about earlier, where we're leading a major breach investigation, the only reason they knew was because the hackers sucked out a 10-gigabyte file from a production database that crashed the system. Next one, does your security program match the risk tolerance? Very important. You want to make sure that depending on where you want to be in the cyber continuum, you have appropriate policies and controls in place. This last one is critical. Again, from working on numerous breaches, this is the question that really determines if investigators or attorney generals, et cetera, would pursue an investigation? Would a prudent person whose company is facing similar risks implement a cybersecurity program in a similar manner? So you could ask that about yourselves relative to your peer group, and I think that'll give you a tremendous amount of insight into the status of your program and if you need to do anything. Okay, so how do you develop a cyber program? What goes into it? The first and most important thing is top-down. Cyber is not, and I can't stress this enough, it's not about the latest tool or doing penetration tests or firewalls. It's top-down. It's a business-level risk. So what that means is you need to understand where your business goals and strategies are, what your position is in the market, where do you want to be, how does your IT strategy and systems and people match that strategy, and also, are there any new or emerging compliance-driven initiatives that would dictate a particular technology or cyber program? That's going to give you the framework of what you're dealing with and how advanced your cyber program needs to be. Then it comes down to really governance. You're trying to build a program. Again, we see a lot of companies that when it comes to cybersecurity, when we ask them about their program and their strategy, they start talking tech with us. So, well, we just put in a new firewall, or, you know, Jane Doe in security, she ran some scans and, you know, we're working on that. It's not about that. It's really, that's not a program. That's not a strategy. That's not a business level orientation. You need someone responsible for that. At a large company, they have a CISO or Chief Information Security Officer. At some companies, obviously, smaller ones aren't going to hire a full-time person, but yet someone needs to be designated as the owner to be able to develop and implement a strategy to protect the organization. You need good policies. You need reporting. This is incredibly important. How do you know the board of directors or yourselves as senior executives are aware of the status of your current cyber program and vulnerabilities? And also, of course, any regulatory reporting requirements. Then you get into the actual mechanics of the program. So what we've laid out here pretty much aligned to just about any framework, whether it's compliance-driven or just good practices. This sort of tells you, this is the layout of the thing. And not to say that you need all of these things, but you do need to do a risk assessment to determine if you need all of these things. So, for example, if you're not doing anything on the website, if you don't have a large web presence or external presence online, then you may not need a penetration test. But again, all of these things are part and parcel to good security program. So let's talk a little bit about some of these and as they relate to some compliance initiatives. Okay, so there's been this term that has been evolving in the market called reasonable security. Reasonable security, by the way, is if you have all of those things on that previous slide, or you've done a risk assessment to determine if in fact you don't need any of those, or you've made a logical assessment as to what needs to be in place and you've put a plan together, that's reasonable security. Let's talk about what happens when there isn't reasonable security and why this is changing a lot of compliance-driven initiatives. So in 2014, Wyndham Hotels, I'm not trying to pick on them, this is public information, they were hacked about 2 years earlier. And the reason was they felt that Wyndham did not uphold, quote unquote, as a term again, reasonable and appropriate security. There was a little bit of a disconnect where the investigators said, you didn't meet the standard, and Wyndham said, well, we think we did. And it went back and forth, all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the reason was Wyndham did not, at the time, base their security program on any known standard. It was considered rather haphazard, and the courts didn't like that. Ultimately, I believe they were reprieved of those fines, were settled for a much lesser degree. And the reason was they actually had an independent security assessment done by an outside firm. So the courts felt, well, at least they were taking the right steps. So we've seen, now this was a big one that happened. So California, state of California, after seeing what happened with Wyndham and working with other breaches, they actually drew the line in the sand last year. They said reasonable security for state of California means this, and they tied it to 20 key controls. And you can go online and look at these, but these are very intense controls. And it wasn't like, you need to do a risk assessment or we think you should do this. It's like, no, here's the bar. This means reasonable security. So what that did is it shifted things in favor of the courts, if you know what I mean, right? The bar it's right out there. Here's what it means if you hold California data, regardless of where you are in the nation. You need to make sure you have all these controls in place. If not, it would be deemed unreasonable and inappropriate. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, again, this was something that's happening in Europe. However, it's an EU-driven initiative, but it applies to any organization, even in the U.S., that's holding EU data. Again, they want to talk about, what is reasonable security, and then New York Department of Financial Services, and I realize this probably doesn't affect anyone on here, but they came out with their new standard of saying we need to see reasonable measures. This really affects banks and other financial institutions. But you see a pattern here, right? This is really where the world is going. They want to look through the lens of what is reasonable. And what is reasonable are having those controls that we showed in the last slide and doing a risk assessment to determine which specific ones you need and at what level. There's another trend that we're seeing, in that there's an expanding definition of what is considered covered data under these rules. In other words, what data do you need to protect? So in the European Union, under GDPR, you see that list, it's a lot more than what in the United States. In the U.S., when we go to companies, most organizations, when they think about critical data, they think credit card data or social security data. Well, take a look what they're doing in the EU. And by the way, companies in the U.S. that hold EU data need to comply with this. There's location, online identifier, other things. There's also a new standard that came out for, and we put this in because some of you, we know, are Department of Defense contractor. This is called DFARS, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. Essentially, there's a set of controls, I'm going to show these in a second, that any contractor to the Department of Defense, you need to have a certain amount of cybersecurity controls in place by the end of this year. And you can see what's in this. Basically, most of the contract provisions of what you're working on, they consider protected data. And then what we were talking about with the DFS, Department of Financial Services in New York, it's a lot more, of course, than just account number, right? It's social security number, which is obvious, but driver's license, okay, any security code, health condition. So again, folks, I just want to make you aware that there is a convergence of different legislation. And by the way, for some of these, and again, from working with various attorneys general, that they're picking up on this, and you're going to see more and more compliance-driven requirements that have expanded views of what data needs to be protected. I mentioned earlier the DFARS required controls because some of you had questions on this if we were going to cover it. We're not going to go through all of these, but if you are a Department of Defense contractor, which I know at least several of you are on this call, these are the controls that you need to have in place by December of this year. So you can take a look at these. These are very similar to the ones that we just showed. Again, we're not going to go through these, but they all relate to the same things, folks. It's, do you have a program? Do you have appropriate risk management? Do you have your systems and critical data identified and protected? So now let's talk about what you need to do to get started. Okay, I know many of you, there's all different sizes of companies on this call. Some probably are global and have full security teams. Others may just be starting and wondering what to do. But essentially, it comes down to this. Like we talked about, you have to have ownership and governance. Who's responsible for it? It has to be a designated individual that is provisioned with the authority to make decisions about what needs to be put in place regarding cybersecurity. Again, all based on the data that you have. So then you start building the program. You do a risk assessment. A risk assessment is when you go in and you look at all of the things and the threats that are out there based on the data, and you start asking some relevant questions. Again, some of the ones that we put in earlier. But also, for example, if you have your critical data sitting on a server somewhere, just think through, okay, how would someone get that? How could someone inside the organization gain access to that? Do we have appropriate controls? Who are the administrators? Is it externally facing? How does it look from a system architecture perspective? What vulnerabilities do we have? And that gives you it lays out the program and lays out the issues that need to get fixed. You obviously we recommend coupling that with some technical assessments as well, running some scans. If you don't have the ability to do that, there are multiple companies that can assist you with that. Then you put in the appropriate controls in place that protects the data, that can detect threats, that will allow you to even respond and recover. You know, recovery is so important these days. We've dealt with many organizations that were hit with ransomware, and in some cases, the only option they have is to recover, meaning they have to wipe the system or restore from a backup somewhere. So you want to make sure those backups work. In some cases, we've seen companies shut down for a long period of time because they never tested their backup. Lastly, you want to make sure you have policies in place. The policies I laid out there are really aligned to just about any standard and are the foundation for any program. It doesn't mean you need all of them, but to the extent these apply, for example, if you're doing system development and so forth, you want to make sure you have application development policy and quality assurance, et cetera. So the point is you want to do that risk assessment, bake in the controls, and lay the policies that are going to govern the program. Okay, so I'm going to finish up before I turn it over to Ken with just a brief case study. So we were working with, this is a global manufacturing and distribution firm. They manufacture products. They have plants all over the world. They distribute all over the world, export, import, et cetera. They're a public company, and they engaged us to do a risk assessment. Again, that's looking at their program through good practice standards, essentially making sure they have all of those controls in place that I showed in the earlier slide. Do a penetration test. That means having us try to break in the same way a hacker would, using the same tools, tactics, and procedures. We did a plant visit to look at one of their manufacturing plants, and we also did what's called a compromise assessment, where we loaded tools on the network and monitored them to look for anomalous behavior to see if we detected any type of malicious activity that may indicate they were hacked. So let me just set the stage. So we were engaged, and I show up with my team, and we're at a kickoff meeting. And at the kickoff meeting, there was the CEO, actually not the CEO, sorry, it was like the chief operating officer, the CFO, the head of legal, the head of manufacturing, and the head of IT. And we just started, just asking some questions, what's important to them. And I wanted to go through a little bit about what came out from that meeting. Okay, so first of all, they said, well, we don't think we're a target. Okay, fine. I hear this all the time from companies. We don't think we're a target. You get every reason known to man. We're too small, or we have all this stuff. We don't really have critical data. Okay, fine. So they said, we don't hold credit card data. That was one of the reasons why they didn't think they were a target. Fine. They said, okay, even if a plant was shut down, we have multiple plants processing, other products. So they thought. This was interesting. They said, we only do business with about 100 long-standing customers. And, if any of their data were breached, they said, we would just basically call them up and we'd be okay. They'd be okay with that because we've been doing business with them, for years and years and years. I like this one. They said, don't tell me I'm at a higher risk just because we're a public company, and do business in Russia and China. Russia and China obviously are known, hacking havens from state-sponsored attacks. Next one, okay. And then they were like, okay, even if our company was shut down from a hack, we could restore operations from our German data center. So, I kind of politely asked the question, so why am I here? Because basically you're telling me you have no risk, everything's fine, even if you got hacked, big deal. I've heard this plenty of times before too. It turns out that someone on the board of directors was actually astute enough to raise this question. So what happened was this company, when in their risk management program, when they were reporting to the board, they never listed cyber as a high risk, probably because of what they were describing here. Someone on the board said, okay, that's fine. I'm kind of tired of seeing this. All these other companies that fit our profile are getting hacked, and you're saying that we're not a risk. Well, I want an independent assessment. And I'll tell you, it's a good thing they did, because let me tell you what we found. We found a lot. Okay, first of all, they had zero physical security, meaning that all of their equipment at the plant could have been compromised by anybody walking in. Those pictures on the right-hand side were taken when we went to visit the plant tour. This is unprotected. You walk in the front door, off to the side, not even in a closet. These are all of the switches and servers that ran the logic controllers and all that ran the manufacturing plant. We could have unplugged everything and just shut them down. Their firewalls between the plant and the corporate network, there has to be this delineation. They were very old firewalls. So they were actually, think about it as someone built the wall to keep the corporate data separated from the data that ran the plants. Well, that wall has been old and is starting to get pretty torn down. So we actually found a way through from corporate, which is a large vulnerability. So from the corporate network, we could actually go in and access the systems inside the plant. When they were bragging about their restore capability in Germany, they didn't really have any. This was something that someone had told them, and they didn't have the right equipment put up in place. So if, in fact, they were shut down in the U.S., they wouldn't have been able to restore except for maybe going out and buying completely new equipment. Probably would have taken about a week. We were told that they didn't do any proprietary manufacturing, and it's not that big of a deal. It turned out there was a group that was actually working on a very proprietary formulation, and they wanted to keep it secret. And also we found malware on the system that was actually from China and was monitoring the plant function, presumably to gather data so China could have more intelligence when they compete with them in the market. So net, we found a lot of things, and it really opened up their eyes to things that they were missing, and then we helped them put a plan in place. So that's why, no matter who you are, and this was a global company that had a lot of sophisticated technology and didn't really fit the risk profile, or so they thought, and yet still had a lot of issues. So that's why, folks, it's so important to put those controls in place that we spoke about. Now, with that, for the second half of this, I want to turn it over to Ken Fishkin, who's going to walk us through a little bit more about what is currently a global epidemic and what you need to do about it for ransomware.
Thanks, Jim. The reason why I really wanted to focus on just ransomware is because it's in the news so often now and it has affected so many people and companies at such a high rate. Now, to really understand what ransomware is, I provided everybody here with an example of what it would look like if your computer were to get hacked. So not only would it affect the computer, but we've seen movie theaters have this screen, airplane seats where it shows the movie have this screen. Medical devices would have this as well. So anyone that's infected with the WannaCry virus would have a screen like this. And there's little you can do if you do have it. So, for example, if you try to hit the escape key to get anything, you wouldn't be able to do anything. The only thing you could do would be to pay the ransom and hope that you would be able to get back to your computer. So there really is no other option except for this if you were to get it. Hopefully you would have backups to restore any critical data, but a lot of companies, as we've seen, did not have that as a result. 12 hospitals were down as a result of this virus, and they had to move all the emergency care patients to other hospitals. And there's even hospitals now that have moved to a paper environment because of that, because they don't want to have this environment, they don't want to have this situation to ever happen again. So you could see here, this was the infection of the WannaCry virus that is spread mostly through Europe and Russia. And when the virus afterwards, the Petya virus, came along, it affected mostly the Ukraine. And what they've analyzed now was that the virus really wasn't looking to do this for monetary reasons, the next virus, because they were only charging about $300 per person or company, and they were only targeting a certain area. And the timing of it was so close that it really, it was their Independence Day. It was the Ukraine's Independence Day. So everybody now believes that this was really sponsored by Russia, the Petya virus. So not only is it for monetary purposes, but it could also be used for political purposes as well. To better explain how the virus works in some cases, and this is not in all cases, but basically you would get, you would go to your email or you would go to your web browser and you would open up an attachment or you would click on a link, and from there it would go onto your computer and run some code. It wouldn't have to install anything necessarily, and from there it would contact the mothership that would have viruses ready to go to be installed on your computer. And not only would it be able to infect your computer, but it can infect other computers that it's connected to as well. So it could be spread all different ways. It can affect many different machines, whether you clicked on the link for an email attachment or not. That's how serious the viruses are today. Here is what ransomware looks like if you were to get it. It looks like complete gibberish, but these would be the actual files, the Word documents, PowerPoint, the Adobe Acrobat files that you would work with on a regular basis. They would be unusable to you unless you were to pay somebody to decrypt them for you. And they would come up with very creative ways for them to get you to pay. For example, they could say, if you don't want to pay us, send the same virus to 5 of your friends. And if those 5 friends got the virus, then you wouldn't have to pay. Another example would be that if you were to go to a website and give positive feedback about their ransomware, they would give you credit after you pay. And another one would be that it would be just for a game, like you'd have to shoot down aliens in a video game, and if you were able to get a certain score, the files would be decrypted. So because these are made by hackers who really have all different motivations, it's an evolving threat. So how did we get here? The biggest reason why we got here is because of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is currency that can only be used over the internet, and it's done anonymously, and it doesn't need to work with a third-party vendor like a credit card company. So 2 parties could work together and make a transaction without any kind of record of who sent what and who received it. it is very easy also it is also very inexpensive. All you need is a black market credit card, which you can get for $5, a prepaid cell phone for about $20, and an email address. And with that, you're ready to go and create your own ransomware. They've made it so easy now that I gave you below here a screenshot of a YouTube video that somebody put out on how to use their custom-made ransomware that you could private label and put your own logo on. With that, you'll even have marketing information. You'll find out how many people clicked on your ransomware, what people were paying. It gives you, they can now give you all this kind of information as if it was a real legitimate commercial product. The problem is that a lot of countries are not cracking down on this problem like we are in the U.S. And as a result, people are flocking to this as a solution to solve their monetary problems. Email is very easy to send this type of a virus because there is virtually no security built into it. It was really meant in the 1970s as a way just to communicate back and forth, and not much has evolved since then to really make sure that it's secure. These attacks are mostly performed via email links or attachments, but they can be found on websites. For example, if you go to Facebook, it is very easy for someone to plant these malicious viruses on advertisements. And while they are trying to crack down on it, the new ones just keep being built up. It is very easy to deploy a web server that has all these viruses. It takes them just a few minutes. And not only that, it's all automated. So nobody's going around making these virus servers anymore. They just run scripts, and the whole process is automated in minutes. So the second one is taken down, another one or another 10 are brought back up. So it's a real game of whack-a-mole as a result. Another thing that I wanted to bring to everybody's attention is USB sticks. Those are those little keys that you can put into your computer that hold data. Well, you can put viruses on those as well. In fact, that is how the Stuxnet virus was spread to the Iranian centrifuges to stop their production. So they were distributed in their parking lot, and the workers at the Iranian centrifuge where they worked on the centrifuges picked them up and put them into their computers. And as a result, that virus was able to spread. Surveys have now come up with depictions of showing where the targets are, and it's not too surprising that the biggest target is the United States. But what is the biggest surprise is that the majority of these attacks are also coming from the United States. And that's because it's so easy to create web servers in the US because all you need is a credit card. And there's no other validation techniques needed. So we're using our own servers against us to perpetuate this threat from occurring. So I wanted to go into ways that we can all combat this ransomware. Some traditional ways might be endpoint security, such as antivirus or other tools that you can install on workstations or mobile devices. Patch management, making sure that your Microsoft Windows updates are always up to date. That you might have some spam filtering in place. Like Google has a great spam filtering. Not too many people get spam from them as much as they used to. Content filtering, which basically means that when you go to a website and you're blocked from your company, when you're using your company's internet access, it is using categories to block certain websites. So like pornography or gambling, things like that. And lastly, user awareness training, which I'm going to go into more detail, but that's basically training employees on how to spot viruses and malware when they enter your email, or to not click on certain links while you're at work or at home. A neat tool, a neat service, I should say, from a company called Proofpoint really gives everybody a second chance to click on before they click on a link. For example, on the left is an email from Groupon, and it shows different links it has different links that you can click on. With the help of Proofpoint, all your email goes through them first, and as a result, they can strip out those links and show you exactly where they're going. For example, you can see where the arrow's pointing to. It's no longer going to Groupon.com, it's going to Groupon.scam.ru. So with the assistance of tools like this, you could really take another look and say, wait a second, I shouldn't click on that link because it's obviously a phishing attack. Now, some of you may have gotten emails from people that you know and love, and they didn't actually come from those people. That's because their email has been compromised. Now, for a company, it could be extremely serious. If someone's asking, like if suppose your CEO is asking you to do a wire transfer or is asking for W-2 forms, it could be very believable if they have compromised that email account or a subordinate's email account. They could see how the communication is going between the two people, and then at the right moment say, okay, please send me a wire transfer to this account and click on this link. So in order to avoid something like that, you might want to implement something called multi-factor or two-factor authentication, which is something you know, which could be a password, something you have, which could be something like an iPhone. And with that iPhone, a message would be, you would have to click on it to verify that it's you. And lastly is biometrics, which could be a retina eye scan or a thumbprint. So just to go back, as far as something you have, it could be one of those tokens that you have to use for a bank. It's just basically something other than a password. And that way, if someone tries to hack into the account, they won't be able to because they won't have that second item to enter that account. Another technique that is very popular these days is called sandboxing and honeypots. These two techniques allow a test environment for a virus to go into before it goes to an employee. So for example, somebody sends you a PDF file or a Word file. It could run in a lab environment first, like so a fake workstation is actually running and opens up that particular file, and it sees if it's a virus or not. And if it isn't a virus, it could send it off to the correct person. So a lot of technology right now can provide this type of service. At a minimum, I really suggest that you start taking a look to make sure that you are locking down your workstations properly. So for example, if you have some of the common software like Flash Player or iTunes or Java or Microsoft Office, that they should be updated on a regular basis. And if you have something called Apple QuickTime, which used to be very popular, I suggest you remove it right away because it's no longer supported by Apple. So take a look at what you have, and this is called whitelisting. Only allow the applications that you absolutely need on your machines, and anything that is not, that shouldn't be on there should not be allowed on there. It's a tricky thing for some companies, but if you can do it, I highly recommend it. Other ways that you could prevent ransomware from getting onto your computer is called file integrity monitoring. What this does is that it'll alert you or stop if ransomware is trying to infect sensitive files like that operate your computer. Ransomware has a tendency to hide there, in certain places where antivirus can't find it. So if you have these tools, you'll have a better chance of it being spotted. Least privileged user access. What I mean by that is that you should never be an administrator of your computer. A lot of companies that are small or don't have a large IT staff usually have this kind of setup where they can install whatever programs they want on their computer because the IT department can't be there all the time whenever a person needs packages to be installed. But as a result, viruses can be installed very easily as well now because there's nothing restricting one of them from being installed after a user clicks on an email or attachment or a link. And there's other items that I don't want to go into too much right now that could lock down your systems as well. Other things that you can do to make sure that if you do get breached, that you at least have some kind of recourse are things like making sure that you have offline backups. And what I mean by that is that today's ransomware is not only looking at sensitive data, but it's also looking at your backups. It is checking to see if there's any files that look suspiciously like backup files, and it will encrypt them as well and make them unusable. So as standard practice, even if you have a personal computer, I would have offline backups as well. The last thing you want is to have to pay this ransomware. Because even if you pay this ransomware, the files may still, the computers may still be infected, and then you might know, and maybe a week later you may get charged, you may find out that you have another ransomware attack. So the best approach is always make sure that you have backups, and if you do have a ransomware, to wipe your computer from scratch and start all over again. There's something called shadow copies that you might want to start enabling on your computer, and all computers can do this, where you have additional copies of a certain file. So if a particular file is encrypted, then you can always revert to an older version of it. User behavior analytics is very interesting right now. It's a way of taking a look at your patterns of how your company operates data and will alert you of exceptions. For example, if I use the files from 9 to 5 on a regular basis, but then all of a sudden I start using a file at 4 o'clock in the morning, I would be, my actions would alert IT of what's going on. And then they would know, oh, maybe Ken's machine got compromised because he doesn't work at 4 o'clock in the morning. Or if I'm trying to access a file over and over again that I don't have permissions to, that would be another thing that would set off alarm bells. Other strategies are like threat detection, where you could take a look at the whole landscape of your network and really find out what's going on from a more global perspective. You're no longer guessing about what people are doing based on the controls that you put in place. For example, the things that I talked about before, such as content filtering or endpoint security. Now you can really see if your tools are being used effectively. For example, we had a company that thought that they had everything in place, and we showed them that everything has been circumvented with what they put in place, and that people were able to download movies, go to pornography websites, and do whatever they wanted to do. So without these kind of tools, you're really hoping and praying that your controls are effective, but you really don't know for sure. Another tool that you can deploy to really get a handle to make sure your sensitive data is where it's supposed to be is something called data loss prevention. So let's say I was to have an Excel spreadsheet that had a whole bunch of Social Security numbers on it of my employees. That could be tagged now, and no matter what I did to that file, whether I renamed it or whether I zipped it or converted it into something else, I would not be able to email that or put it onto Dropbox or anything like that because it would be tagged as classified information. and it is very effective. And if you do have the type of data that you do not want to leave and you have little trust or you're not sure if your employees would make these kind of mistakes, you might want to start looking and investing in these kind of tools. One of the last things I want to talk about is that if you do get ransomware and you don't have good backups and you do not have any recourse, there are still some other options. So there are websites like this one that are sponsored by large players like Cypersecurity and Intel that have a whole list of decryption tools. They can even decrypt Petya now. So they can't do the newest one, which is not Petya, but before you pay, take a look at these websites and you might be able to recover your data. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Jim.
Well, thanks. Thanks a lot, Ken. So that concludes the webinar. I think we have some time for questions. So, Melissa, do you want to open it up for questions, or do we get?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jim and Ken. Very, very interesting presentation, especially the case study. It's quite eye-opening. For folks on the line, if you'd like to ask a question over the phones, please hit *1 and then record your name, and we will get you into the queue. And operator, have we had any questions come in?
We do have one queued up. One moment. Your first question comes from Dan Challingsworth. Your line is open.
Yes, I have a very specific question on the physical protection under NIST 800-171. We're currently going through the process of, garnering towards compliance under this, and one of our big issues is what is considered to be physically protected for a CUI in this process.
What is considered to be physically protected? Oh, you mean like what do you need to do? What steps do you need to do?
Yep.
Yes, specifically like for files it would be considered CUI, like hard copies.
Oh, I know that you have, for hard copies. Okay, so you definitely need to have a locked room.
Right.
So you have to have it where, I don't know if you have to go too far. You don't have to have individual IDs,
right.
like a fob or something like that, but you do have to have it locked, and you have to have a log that people sign out every time they open the room and close the room. So that's about, as far as like physical documentation, that's the level that you need to go for DFARS.
Okay. Now, if there was, say specific CUI, say in my office, during the day I will leave it open, but if I lock it at night when I go home, would that still be considered secure?
No, no, because somebody could just walk in and do it while you're at lunch. So okay. I would always close the door if you're leaving it. You can leave it open when you're in it, obviously. But if you're going out to lunch, I would close it, because you're talking about paper here. It'd be one thing if you're talking about digital. You can do screen locks, so that way they would have to guess your password or do two-factor authentication. But for physical, I would make sure that everything is locked.
Okay. Thank you.
As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please press *1 and please record your name clearly when prompted. One moment, please, for your next question.
And while we wait for the next audio question, we did have one come in over the written queue, and that is, you described many standards being set by states. Is there one overarching body in the United States that sets security standards for federally funded research in the U.S. and internationally?
So is there one overarching standard? And the answer is...
Or actually, is there one overarching body in the U.S. that sets the security standards?
So no. So there's bodies that set frameworks and suggested guidance. So like NIST, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, is probably the largest. And then what happens is other type of agencies, depending on the industry or the state, will take that standard. Again, usually it's NIST. Sometimes if it's international, it's usually ISO, because NIST is a US-based standard, and they would craft their own specific guidance around that. So, for example, for HIPAA, which I know is not relevant to you all, that's set by a federal agency, and they've updated it based on the NIST framework. For GDPR, which is affecting the European Union, that was largely based on various ISO, International Standards Organization type of controls. So for those of you operating in the United States, if you're using the NIST framework, and there's a lot of information on this, and there was that chart that we showed earlier on. Ken, you might want to go back to that, the one that showed the high-level framework. Everything really maps back mostly to NIST. So while there's not an overarching body, if you base your standards off of the NIST framework and you have these controls in place, you're generally going to be in pretty good shape. I would just pass it. Yeah. Okay, there it is.
Great, thanks, Jim. Operator, did we have any other questions come in?
I am showing no further questions at this time.
Jim, Ken, did you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience?
No, the only thing I wanted to add is that, again, hopefully we cleared up some of the mysteries and provided some guidance. I know a lot of the participants come from different backgrounds and, from industries, and different type of standards apply. But generally speaking, what's laid out here, really, if you put those in place based on a risk assessment, you will fare far better from just about any other company, whether it's warding off hackers or, in case you were hacked, dealing with the onslaught of investigations if you have these good controls in place. Ken, do you want to add anything?
The only thing I could say is that really you need to make sure that your data is backed up, because that is going to be the be-all and end-all if you're going to be able to survive ransomware. It's only going to it's going to hit harder, it's going to hit multiple machines more frequently, and the attacks are getting much more sophisticated.
And operator, we'll do one final check to see if any last-minute questions have come in.
I'm still showing no questions.
Okay, with that, Jim, Ken, again, many thanks for sharing a bit of your expertise today. I thought this was a very informative and comprehensive program on cyber. So hopefully folks are walking away a little bit better educated and with a good plan of action in place. So thank you again, and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining today's conference call. You may disconnect at this time.